It is a great pleasure to be here to talk about this topic, which the fact that you're here means you're fairly interested in. We've called it Rethinking Assessment, Measuring What Matters. And tonight I'm going to basically not go into too much theory, but talk a little bit about why we're doing this and what we're doing, and a little bit of theory as to how we're doing it. So I'd like to start the presentation by acknowledging where I'm speaking from tonight. So I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging of the Dharawal people, Aboriginal people, the traditional owners or custodians of the land from which I speak to you this evening. I'm speaking to you from Caringbah in New South Wales, and basically it's around about 9:30 at night here. And I know people are in different places around the world, and so it's thank you for coming, and it's a pleasure to be here. I guess there's a number of things that prompted us to start on this journey of let's start measuring what matters, or measuring what we value. And but one of the key drivers has been this idea in Australia, and I'm sure in other systems around the world, where people are saying, well, we want to measure how our education system is going, and here we have that. We want to measure how Australian education is going. It's been a real challenge for us. And so, if you're going to start to measure anything like that, then what you have to do is say, well, if I want to measure how our education system is going, if I want to measure how our students are going, etc., I've got to say, well, what's our education system supposed to be doing? What are our students who are doing in physics? What are they supposed to be doing? And so we started by saying, in Australia, what does the government require of our students in terms of at the end of their schooling, or when our schooling and when they go on to university, etc.? What do the government require us to instill in our students? And to answer that, in Australia, they had a meeting in the middle of Australia, in Alice Springs, and they updated a declaration of what it is the government requires of our education system, and they called it the Alice Springs or Mapartini Education Declaration. And it had a number of goals. One of those goals is that all young Australians must become confident and creative individuals, successful lifelong learners, and active and informed members of the community. So we as educators, we as teachers, we as administrators, we as researchers, whatever we're doing, we have to try and make sure we produce students and citizens and adults that have those sorts of characteristics. What does that mean? So in a normal testing situation, we want to be able to do some mathematics, or you want to be able to do some arithmetic and arithmetic and space and measurement. What does that mean? So what is confident and creative individuals? Well, that's all spelled out for us, because if you go further into the declaration, confident and creative individuals who have a sense of self-worth, self-awareness, they have personal identity, their emotional, mental, cultural, spiritual, and physical well-being. We've got to make sure they have all those characteristics there, those things that we value. We expect our students to be able to develop personal values and attributes such as honesty, empathy, loyalty, responsibility, and respect for others. So just in that first goal there, that first requirement to produce confident, creative individuals, we're being asked to make sure that whatever we do in our schools, we've got students with those characteristics or those values. Now, that's just a small number. There's a whole pile under there. So, but rather than go through all of them, because I don't want to spend too much time, the second thing we have to do is have students who are successful lifelong learners. We all talk about that. So what are some of the things that will tell me that our students are lifelong learners? Well, they've got to have the ability, develop their ability and motivation to learn. To be a lifelong learner, students have to be able to be motivated to learn. So we've got to teach them how to be motivated to learn, play an active role in their own learning, have essential skills in literacy and numeracy. Of course, most countries will have that, and use technology. So that's another thing we're asked to do. So we've got to make successful lifelong learners. Here are some of the things we've got to make sure we're covering in our schools so that our students have this. If we go to the third one, active and informed members, they've got to, we want our students and we want our population to act with moral and ethical integrity. Appreciate and respect Australia's rich social, cultural, religious, etc., and have an understanding of our government systems. Right, so, and we can act with moral and ethical integrity and so on. You get the idea. This is what our Australian education system has been charged to do. Now, built into that, of course, is, as I said, there's literacy, numeracy, there's some science, maths, etc. That's all there, but this is what we're asked to do. We're not the only country that do this, of course. I've done a fair bit of work in China, and I don't know if this is still the case, but this used to be their list of non-cognitive skills in their quality comprehensive evaluation framework. These are the characteristics they want their education system to impart in their population. And you can see, you know, students cherish life, they're law-abiding, honest, trustworthy. India have got the same sorts of characteristics. Malaysia, we've all got them, you know, and so when you're starting off as somebody who's interested in measurement and assessment and what our schools are doing, and you say, well, what are we required to do? Then you go through and you look in each country, you will find these, right? They are part of our mandate. So, and I don't stop there in terms of universities. That's our school system. Universities are part of that, but universities also, because I think this should go across all sectors, universities are also being challenged and charged with not only teaching students accounting or philosophy or maths, they're being charged with producing students who have capabilities which go beyond the traditional disciplinary knowledge. We call those graduate qualities or graduate attributes. And tonight I want to talk a little bit about those two sectors and how we're trying to take up that challenge here. So you'll see I'll talk a little bit about the graduate qualities and the sorts of things that we've got in ours, and I'll show you this later on. Critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, communication, cultural competence and influence. As a university, just as the government said, this is what we want our students to have in that declaration as a university, and most universities around the world, I think most of them in Australia now, will have these. They will say, we want our students to have these values. We want them to be culturally competent. We want them to be able to communicate. We want to be able to influence. That's what our university has decided, that these are the things that will characterize graduates from our university. So you can see that what that's done there is painted a picture of really what I think most of us in most countries who are interested in this sort of area are working on, and saying, well, we've got to do that. How do we do it? And more importantly, how do we know we're doing it well? Now I want to show you what actually happens. So that's it. In Australia, we then say, well, that's our declaration. Let's put across that a measurement framework. And the measurement framework we have, we call it the Measurement Framework for Schooling in Australia. And it is a report which says how we're going in schools in Australia. So it's saying how we as a teaching force are progressing. And you can get copies of these reports, etc. I'm sure you've got them in your own country. And if you look at that report, then our program, how we're measured, basically comes down to traditional measures. We have national literacy and numeracy tests for our children at grade 3, 5, 7, 9. It's a census test. Everybody does it, and this says here's the results. This is how we're going as a country. We do other tests, civics and citizenships, a sample test, information and communication technology, standardized tests where we actually monitor how we're going as a country. And that's why it's part of our measurement framework. And you can see, well, we've got literacy tests, which are just basically literacy tests, and numeracy tests, which are measuring number, yeah. We've got civics and citizenship, that's measuring some of those things in that charter, and so on. We go further, we have PISA results are used to judge our system. Well, PISA results are looking at literacy of maths, science, and reading, or something like that. That's a pretty narrow thing, but the results, we're starting to get a little bit broader in what we're measuring there. International citizenship and so on. We're trying to do a little bit more, but effectively our system in their measurement framework for Australia looks at the results for PISA. TIMS, you've all heard these, PEARLS and so on. And then you've got a few other measures like attendance. So now, if anyone who's interested in any sort of measurement, and you think, all right, the first thing about measurement, the measurement has to be fair, it's got to be valid, it's actually got to be measuring what we're supposed to be doing. When you look at that and you say, well, we've got a measurement framework which is producing information, which is saying how we're going as a system, which is looking at these things. But when I looked at what's in what we're supposed to deliver, things like honesty, empathy, these sorts of things that we're supposed to, there's no mention of it. So how can this be? How can we have having a valid measure of what it is we're supposed to be delivering? Now, in any country, I think if you start to look at what's happening, you'll find that. And one of the reasons is because we mix up validity with standardization. I've got to be able to standardize everything. Everybody's got to do the same test, same day, so I can compare. But that isn't validity. And yet we, as educators, we as measurement people, we as policy makers, must be looking at fairness. So if we're saying we're doing this, maybe we've got to align the way we're measuring and reporting on our system to what we're supposed to be doing. At the moment, if you look at this, you can say we're judging our system and saying whether our teachers are good, our students are good, all those sorts of people write it up, politicians make statements about it. We make all that on the basis of less than 3% of what we're asked to do. Well, that's not a valid measure. So that's what started us talking about this. I actually started talking about this actually on some work I was doing in India with CBSE and the government in those days about let's start measuring some capabilities, etc., and how do we do it. But in terms of Australia, we kind of tracked back and said, what are we supposed to do? What are we doing? And how are we measuring it? And then how are we disseminating it? And how valid is this as a way to say how we're going as a system? And we've done a fair bit of work. One of our students has done a PhD in this area, and it was basically, as it's stated there, let's start measuring what matters for Australian schools. And you notice the topic for this whole thing was let's start measuring what matters effectively. Sarah Ratner has got a PhD thesis, which you can probably get if you want to have a look at it. But she actually took this up as a challenge. And we spoke to some key people, to say, well, if you had a clean slate, if you had a clean page, and I want to find out how we're going as a system here, how would you do it? How would you start measuring what matters for Australian schools in a more valid way than what it's being done at the moment? So that was a kind of the first PhD that came from our centre. We've got about 25 PhD students working in different areas, in 5 streams actually, but this is one of the early ones that we did. So this measurement, let's start measuring what matters, if you like, became a real interest from some of our students and myself and other people. And the stimulus for the work that how I've got interested in it, and some of my students are interested in it, is what Andy Hargraves said in 2011 when he's talking about assessment, he said, measure what you value instead of valuing only what you can measure. That's got to be our challenge. He said it, it's got to be our challenge. If we're really going to move forward in this space. I kind of mess around with that a bit, measure what you value instead of only valuing what you can measure. I put that in there because that's what we've done. You see, we can measure numeracy, literacy, ICT, we can measure these sorts of things. That's how we're going to judge everything. So as long as we can standardize it, then we're going to try and make judgments about it. And so we're focusing in on what we can measure. The second person who's had a big influence on me and the way I think here and the way my centre operates and people that I work with, was Lee Cronbach, because it was quite interesting that whenever you talk to people around the world when you're working or whatever, the number of people said, oh, you can't measure that, can't measure that, can't measure that. It's too hard to measure, and that's why we fall back. But Lee Cronbach in 1990, right, said, if a thing exists, it exists in some amount. If it exists in some amount, it can be measured. Very interesting. If a thing exists, it exists in some amount. If it exists in some amount, it can be measured. So in the set of values and goals and things that we had there, we say, does honesty exist? Well, of course it exists. Some people say this person's more honest than this, so on. It exists. So if it exists, we should be able to measure it. And that's our challenge. And I'd like to raise that as a challenge everywhere. Let's take it up. If these are the things we value, and they do exist, because if they don't exist, I don't know how wide we value them. All those things in those lists and the ones in your country, you know, we say we must value them. They're for a mission, we measure them. But we have to take, you know, we have to take a view of measurement. Now, I'm going to talk about measurement and assessment in a minute, but the notion is measuring, right? And so we start to follow what is measurement. So our centre is very much a centre for educational measurement and assessment. So, you know, our focus is on measurement. So we use measurement theories to develop the way we think and the whole way we operate in this space. Because if I go back, not only should I say, you know, but if we value, we've got to measure it, but we also have to say, you know, if these things here are what we value, we've got to be able to measure them, but we've also got to show we're having an impact, that we're actually improving our students from the things we're doing over here. We've actually got more honesty because of what we've done here, we think, in our schools than we had before. So the idea is very much on using measurement with these values, not only to say I can measure it, but also to measure impact. And, you know, one of the challenges I give to a university, we say we value these graduate qualities, and we say, well, that's good, you value them and you put them on your website, but are we as a university, do our students have these values? And is what we're doing in our university in leading to an improvement? We want to know whether there's impact. That's the real question you want to ask. And of course, you want to know whether you're having an improvement or you've got more of something, then you're moving into the area of impact. How can we know that the students have more of whatever thing you're interested in, you value, after they've participated in the teaching and learning programs we've got in Australia or in our university or in your country? How can we know that? The question we're asking is, how do we know that we've had an impact on what it is we value? That's the real question, right? And that's a measurement question. Because you're saying, do we have more of this now as a consequence of what we're doing than we had before? Everybody's got to ask that question. I mean, if I say to an education system, so what is it that characterizes your system? And they say, wow, all our students have a conscience. All our students, you know, have faith. And the next obvious question is, so where's your evidence they've got a conscience? Where's your evidence they've got faith or whatever? And by the way, where's your evidence that what you're doing in your school is improving it? Because if you haven't got that evidence, how can you say this characterizes our system? Now, I'm not saying this has to be done in a really refined way, but it's a way we've got to think if we want to start assessing and measuring what we value. So you can see here, I've started to talk about measurement, and I've put a slide there. So an obvious measure is a thermometer, is a measure of something. And so if I want to measure and talk about impact in the social sciences and the things we're talking about today, and I want to make a distinction between counting and measurement. I'm not necessarily interested in counting. Counting means how many I get right, how many tick cross, add them up, get score, right? And I've got to give mean to that score. So generally I compare it to norms or whatever. Not interested in that. What I'm interested in doing is answering the question about, have I got more of this construct or value or property that I'm focusing on? Have I got more as a consequence of what I'm doing? So we have to think about testing slightly differently, and we've got to think about the performance indicating when we're thinking about assessing and collecting information again of what we're trying to assess. We've got to think about, I've got to provide some evidence which will indicate how much of the construct, whether it be numeracy, literacy, empathy, engagement, whatever, the students have demonstrated, rather than how many marks they've got. How much is a measurement question? And our research, and lots of research, that's not only us, I mean, we're doing this all over the place, and I'm sure you're doing it in your country too, is to say, well, if we're going to talk about measurement, how do we measure those things in the social sciences? And I said we went back to a measurement theory. We tend to focus on Roche theory and the Roche model as the way to develop all this and form a framework from which we think and we measure and so on. So, and Roche theory itself is a measurement theory. And Roche himself, I'm not going to go into this tonight, but Roche himself, he was a physical scientist. And it's appropriate that what we use a measurement theory in the social science actually was derived by physical sciences, because in the physical science, they're quite good at measurement. And he went, if you look at the Roche theory and you want to go back through it, we say, what are the characteristics in the physical sciences that distinguish measurement in the physical science? Well, the properties, objectivity, linearity, and a calibrated scale. That's what I want to show you that we're trying to do tonight in the examples I'm going to talk about. I want to say we've got objectivity. But if the fact is, if you have the evidence and you put it on a scale, we're all going to say the same thing and say, yeah, this evidence aligns with that, and so on. It's objective. That it's a scale which shows growth and so on. It's appropriate that I had that thermometer there, because people say, oh yeah, there's a big difference between people measurement in the social sciences and measurement in the physical sciences, because you can see in the physical science, you can see what you're measuring. Social science, you can't see it. So how can you bring physical and social sciences together? Well, and the example we use, a lot of us around the world, when talking about this, we talk about the thermometer. I can't see heat, but I can actually measure the manifestations of heat by building a thermometer like this. And you know how we do it: put in 0, put ice, put in a flame, and say that's 100, and then we put some calibrations along it. And the manifestations are, as things heat up wherever you are in the world, as things heat up, the atoms and the molecules vibrate faster. They vibrate fast. They generate heat. It forces the mercury or the alcohol or whatever, it forces it up the capillary because it expands. And so you don't have to see things, you see the manifestations of them. I can't see how much science knowledge is in that student's head, but when I give him some questions to do, or I ask some questions of him or whatever, I see the manifestations of what's in there, because I structure these questions well, and it shows me what's in their head. And this is the same for, how we start to measure in the social sciences. We can see some things, but other things we've got to look for the manifestations. But the key point we want to take away from measurement is measurement to us. Remember where I'm coming from? Over here, I've got all these values and adds and all the things that matter to us in a way on top of the content. And I really want to measure those. So, so I want to build a measurement scale. And how do I do that? Well, it's a two-stage process, just like in the physical sciences. When we measure in the physical sciences, first you build the scale, first you build the thermometer, first you build a ruler, first you build a scale to weigh things or whatever. Once you've built the scale, then you bring the thing that you want to measure to it and you put it against the scale. And so you first construct and then you measure what it is you want to measure. So in the way we think about measurement in the social sciences and all those things we talked about, that we said matters to us as countries, we want to try and do exactly that. So the first stage we work on is how are we going to measure something? What's the scale going to look like? What's the measure going to look like? And we use a 4-step process to do this. The first thing you've got to do is to be able to define what's the thing you're going to measure? What is it? What is honesty? What is empathy? And so on. It's quite interesting. If you say to people, if you say to any of your examiners anywhere, or, in most countries, and you say, do your exam papers measure critical thinking? Oh, yeah, we measure critical thinking. Well, can you define what critical thinking is? I haven't thought about it. Well, how can you say it measures it if you don't know what it is? So the first stage is whatever you want to measure, you've got to define it. You think about your curriculum. What is physics? Well, people say this is what physics is. This is what characterizes growth. These are the sorts of things I put in the curriculum which will enable the students to be able to demonstrate that growth and so on. You've got to define it. First step of building a measurement scale of anything, if you want to measure something, has to be, what is it you want to measure? Let's get that definition. Once you've got the definition, you say, well, that's my definition. What are the components? What are the characteristics that make up that definition that I can measure? I call those components. Some people call them attributes. You can call it whatever you like, but we call them components. And in a traditional subject matter sense, you could say, well, I want to measure maths, and the components of maths are space, number, measurement, and so on. The subcomponents, I can split those up, and so on. You can imagine what it looks like. But the third thing is, and just like in that ruler there, not only do you have to say this is it, and these are the things that I want to measure, but you're actually going to have to describe what does growth look like? What is something that's very high on this component? So we're trying now to do the calibrated bit. Let's try and get some descriptions of what more looks like. So our third step, we try and describe increasing levels of performance for each of those components. And out of that, we built a rubric, a measurement rubric. It's got the characteristics of measurement because we want to, these have to show increases. If you follow the Roche theory, You know, if you get to this level, it's got everything that previous level had plus a bit more and so on. And then the next bit is really, really, really important for any measurement tool, measurement device, scale that you develop. You've got to build an evidential argument, which is the evidence that this measurement rubric is really, with its components, is describing growth in the construct that you defined. And they're the 4 steps that we use to build a measurement rubric. And stage 2 is once I've built the rubric, then I've got to say, now I've got to once I've built it, once I've got my scale there, now what tasks, what things am I going to look for that I give my students to do, which will provide me with evidence that I can then put against the rubric. That's how we think about it. That last bit can be done in different ways, but there it is. And then we use the evidence to locate the students on the rubric so we can say that's the best description of them that we've got based on this evidence. Anybody who looks at our evidence, which is based on how we're doing these assessments over here, will end up at the same point. And in that way, we can start to locate people on our rubric and start to see whether performance is improving. So this is just a summary of what we're doing and how we've done it. So there's a little bit of theory, why we're doing this, why we think we're so passionate, we're trying to solve this and happy to work with people on it. You know, you can see why we want to do it, because we think it's the right thing to do. If you're going to start measuring things and saying we've got this, then you've got to work out ways to measure them. This is our basic theory. This is how we work. And we build these measurement rubrics of sort. Now I want to show you 2 quite different examples of how we've done this in Australia, in New South Wales anyway. One is and this is a traditional sort of example. At the end of 12 years of schooling in New South Wales, most of Australian states, we have a public exam on a whole range of subjects. And we use that examination information to give qualifications, credit what it is students know and can do at the end of 12 years of schooling. That's its main function. But we also use quite sophisticated, in some cases, sophisticated scaling techniques to produce a single number to take account of all the evidence we've got there, so we can locate students and rank order them, because we use that for entry to university. So our system at the end of year 12 has 2 functions. First, it is to credit what students know and can do. After 12 years of schooling, here it is. This is the best description we've got for you. Very important that this is what you can do now. And the second part, we use the same information effectively to let people get into our universities. You're now with this score, this is where you rank, and if you've said you want to go to university, you can go to this university and so on. So you can see the dual function of it. If we think in New South Wales, we've got 150 subjects that our students can choose effectively. Each one of those subjects can be considered a construct, something we value, you know, physics, software, maths, or different sorts of maths and so on. You can imagine, they're just traditional subjects. And what we wanted to do is build a system where we could actually say our students have improved, or we're having an impact in our schooling. Because these examinations are so high stakes, you know, it's no good trying to hide them or secure them from year to year. They're used to, by the students to prepare for next year's exam. So it's very hard for us to get an idea of how we're improving because we have different exams at the end of every year. So we went back and answered that question. We want to have a look at impact. How do we do that? We talked about, well, let's think of it as a measurement question. And we started off. Let's start off with our line. Remember I said measurement is, what's the word? Measurement is linear. So we start with a line. Up one end we have high performance, down the bottom we have low performance. And what we did was we said to let's kind of divide that line for year 12 into 6 areas, 6 categories. And we then sent off 150 different subject committees. And we said, write down for us, think of the student who's really the top. What are the characteristics of those students who are at the top of physics or at the top of maths and the English people? What does the student look like? We built up images of those, okay? So they went off and did that. And so we said, really what we've got now, we asked, what are the characteristics of people at the top level? So we're starting to get an image of what the characteristics of those two, an image of a student there. Oh, we can see that. How about the bottom level? Well, we did that. So our groups went off and they actually developed these images, we call them performance standards, of what a top student performance looks like, what a bottom student's performance looks like. Unfortunately, we summarise those descriptions with things like band 6, we called a top performance, band 5, band 4. We didn't want to call 6, 5, 4 because people add those up. We thought, because those numbers aren't numbers, they're just saying that's the descriptor for somebody with these characteristics. And we produced performance bands like this, which says the typical performance of students at band 6 in biology, there it is. And you can see we've started to describe what it is students at that level can do. And I don't want to go through this, but you can see that effectively we've got lots of knowledge about the subject. They've got some lots of whole range of skills, our top students, and they can use that knowledge to create new knowledge, etc. So there you are. There's, this is the rubric we're preparing. That's the top level. You could have knowledge, skills, and other characteristics, whatever. We just describe them like that. There's a band 4, a band 5, and you can start to see the difference between what a 4 looks like, a 5. The first thing people say, well, what's the difference between sound knowledge and thorough knowledge? Well, we did that. What we do is we have exemplars or standards packages which says this is the sort of work produced by students on the border between a 4 and a 5, a 5 and a 6. So we have calibrated our performance standards with exemplars, and so students can see what it means to improve, teachers can see what it means to improve, examiners have to write questions which will enable the students to demonstrate these sorts of things. We think we've got a fairly coherent structure, but the driver is the measurement rubric we've got underpinning it. And then each year we can write new exams to those sorts of standards and those sorts of characteristics there. We can make sure they're assessing the right thing. We can use different exams each year. The students do them. We can take the results, put them on the same scale. And even though they've done different exams, we can actually show, because we've done that equating using judges, we can show how our system is going over time and answer the question, is our teaching having an impact on our performance in biology? The question we really want to answer. So that's, you can look that up on the, the NESA website, how we do all that. Actually, a lot. This work here came from a PhD written by John Bennett, who became a head of the organisation. Does this way back, I think, in the year 1998. I supervised that, but it was built the same basic principles. You know, what matters. We're not interested in top 10% getting this, 10%. We're interested in what it is students know and can do, and we're interested in know as a system, are we impacting? Are our students better now than they were before? Which is interesting, because that's George Ross's question that got him talking and thinking about the whole measurement issue. Let me go to the next one. So if I now look at the University of Sydney, remember I said that, I'll give you an example. School sector, that's pretty well, that's content oriented, etc. Now I want to talk about the university. The University of Sydney has said we want these characteristics, and you can see them. There's 9 of them. Things like influence. Our Senate, our university went through and said, what do we want from our students? What do we value? What matters to us as a university? Okay, there they are. So that once we've got those, and as I said, if you look at any university, they'll have something up there at that time. The question is, and the real question is, how are we going on those, and are we having an impact on them? Just listing them is no good. We've got to be able to work out how do we measure whether we're having an impact. And so we did that process that I talked about over here, the general process. We've done a lot of work in a university trying to measure these. And I'm just quickly going to show you how we did it at a high level. So if I pick cultural competence, right, we say we want our students in our university to be culturally competent, to be aware of the cultural differences and take account of those. So we have a very multicultural university and so on. So if I just pick that one, the first thing you've got to say is, all right, the university said these are what we value. The first question when they asked me, how do we measure them? I said, oh, so what do you mean by that? What's the definition? I said, I don't know. We haven't really thought about that. So the first step, we've got to define it. Now, I don't want to define this for everywhere in the world, by the way. This is our university. This is what we value. This is how we're going to measure it, and we report on that. We're not trying to win everybody in the world over. So we took cultural competence and all the others, and we said, oh, the first thing we've got to do is actually define it and build that rubric that I'm talking about. And it took us a year. We took professors from different faculties and we put them in these groups, and they argued. You can imagine what a definition war in a top research university, across the university, looks like or feels like or occurs. After 12 months, in all of those, we actually did come up with some definitions that we all agreed with. There's the definition that we came up for cultural competence as a university. We, as a university, believe our students should have disability. I'm not going to read it to you, but you can see, oh, that's what they think, that's what they value. We've got a strong influence in there on the Australian context, but it's generic. And it's not only cultural as in race, but it could be gender culture. It could be any sort of culture we're talking about. It's got to apply to that. So if I start with that, then they had to say, well, what are the components of that? What are the things which, that if I say if I can measure these, they will tell me about that definition. They came up, there are 3 components in there. One is our students have to be aware of their own cultural values and worldview. The second component in that definition, they said, the ability to and success in Australia, knowledge system, mature understanding of contemporary issues. They've got to be aware of their own cultures, right? The second one is they've got to actively seek to understand norms and values of other cultures. That's a second part, which if I can measure that, it'll tell me about that definition. And the third one, which comes out of that definition, is the ability to communicate, etc. You can look at this yourself later on. The ability to communicate across and between cultures. They are the components that we say will tell us about that definition. And then we went to step 3, which is what does growth look like on each of those? And the first one, awareness of one's own cultural values and worldwide values and worldview. You've got level 1. If people are just starting on this, that's a description of the image of some students. Growing understanding of one's own cultural values, worldviews, and practice. It may include blah 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 blah. And 4 is it says people who have got the last description there possess deep and broad understanding of one's own group, etc. They've got what 3's got plus a bit more. That's the measurement characteristic that underpins this measurement rubric here. It's a good discussion about level 0 there. Remember, these aren't 4, 3, 2, 1. They're description. That's a code for saying if I see level 4, I'm really saying students with these characteristics on that component. We don't put a descriptor, and we had a pretty good argument about this. We don't do it at a year 12 level either. We don't put a descriptor for 0 because that means they're just starting. It's hard to describe what the characteristics of someone who's just starting on this journey. Got a bit of that and a bit of that. Doesn't make much coherent sense. And we don't want to, we end up falling back to describing what students don't have. And we didn't want to do that. So we decided that 0 there, we write there, we haven't got enough evidence yet that you're at level 1. And in the year 12, in the year 12 performance rubric, we say we haven't gotten enough evidence yet that you are performing at level 2. Right? It isn't. We don't say you haven't got that. You haven't got that. We just haven't got enough evidence yet that you're at that level. And that requires how do we set the standard there, and I haven't got time to go into that tonight, but you can see that. And then the second component, they came up with that definition. The third component, they came up with that definition there. And when you put that together now, you have a measurement scale, a measurement rubric developed by the system, for the system, etc., that you can now start to track student progress along and report at a student level, as I'm going to talk about. Not just a group. You can, if you want to, ask where do you think you are, why do you, and rate yourself. We can build all sorts of assessment tools, but basically we just want to get some evidence about what it is they know and can do, which enables us to put them on that scale. We did that for all 9 of those rubrics. So what do we value? That's what we value. That's what matters to us. How can we measure it? And how can we start talking about whether we're having an impact as an institution on the things that we say are of value to us? And, I've had law school people in the university can't say, oh, these rubrics here, they're values. Our law school, these are values. And yet they're values. That's what we as an institution value. That's what matters to us. That's it. But we don't agree with those values. And I said, well, good, go and find a university where your values match up with theirs. These are ours. And we're not saying everybody in the world has to have these. This is what we value. So it's a very limited way of saying, if you value it, you want to know you have an impact, define it for your system, do it that way. The next stage, there's the first three steps. Step 1, we define the components, identify the components, showed what growth looks like. Then we did a whole pile of work to validate it. We had focus groups within university, within schools and universities. We had our stakeholders come and say, is this the definition? Do you agree with this definition? Do you agree with these components? Does this describe growth? Is this the right word? Blah, blah, blah. You know, we had disciplinary teams look at it. We sent them around the world, the experts around the world, and said, you know, what do you think? Does this match this? And so on. We are building an evidential argument, said this is what we did to say, starting with this definition, these components, do we all agree this is really measuring what we think it's supposed to be measuring? The next bit is the bit that differentiates it, you see, because once we got those rubrics out there, the next question is, well, how do I do the assessment? And if you think about where I started off here, these are the values. So if you see critical thinking and problem solving, as soon as we said these are our values and these are our rubrics, every publishing company in the world wanted to sell me a critical thinking and problem solving test or a cultural competence test. We could have done that. For people who don't know universities, you try and tell universities who have just had these students for 4 years and assess them and say, well, we've done that, now we're going to give them a test to see whether they can critically think, there'd be a public outcry. So we thought about it a bit differently. What we said was, well, you know, if these are the rubrics, let's give these rubrics to our faculties, our schools, and say, you know, at least 2 times during your program, a student's program, you've got to give them the opportunity in your course to demonstrate that they, through the things you give them, what they can do in relation to this construct. So in other words, you've got to design assessment devices. It could be a talk you're going to do in your course, it could be an exam, it could be whatever you want, but you've got to give those students the opportunity to provide you with evidence that you can say, here's my evidence. When I look at this evidence and compare it to that rubric, this is there. This is where they're at. This is the best description. And then we keep the evidence. And so there's no need to standardize the assessment. The task is to say, well, what's the best way for me to collect student evidence from students or the teachers in the different faculties and courses to collect the evidence and use that themselves to put on there, and then we have checks to see that the evidence has been well collected and that it is matching the rubric, etc. And as I said, we keep that because we're going to publish that about each student. And you know, if we say this person's really very good at communication, and then they graduate, and then the faculty, the employers say, hey, you said this guy's pretty good at communication, he can't talk. We say, well, here's the evidence we got that he could talk when he was in our course. It's all structured in that way. So first you assess, you collect the evidence, and then you use the evidence to locate the student performance on the scale. The interesting thing is, when we put those rubrics out, you know, people say, oh, well, every faculty will think, if it's critical thinking, they'll say, oh, you know, the way we assess critical thinking is different than the way arts do it or the way music does it or whatever. So we're going to have to build our own rubrics. And so we offered them, we said, well, here's the rubric we built. We will help you write a discipline-specific rubric for your discipline, but it has to have the characteristics in the overall one. And even when you write your tasks, we will give you task-specific rubrics so you can do that. When in the trialing we've done in our faculties and our schools, they all say, we don't need the discipline, we don't need the generic, because we understand the definition, because we're involved in the components, we can collect evidence in our faculty, which will enable us to do that fairly accurately. So the assessment, and this is quite interesting and important, the assessment, it's not necessary to have a standardized test. We could develop one if we want to. And you can do that. You can do whatever you like, but it's got to be developed to fit the rubric. So when we develop our exams in that HSC example, with the different subjects, we have briefs for our examiners, and they say to us, hey, in physics, these are the questions which are going to enable those students at Band 6 to demonstrate they're at Band 6, and so on. So you write your tests to fit your measurement rubric, and it's the same here. So it's not necessary to have a standardized test. For critical thinking, cultural competence, assessments given to all students, and so on. What you do is the teachers in the various subjects should be invited to build, say, this is an appropriate task for medicine, which will allow me to tell you whether these students are culturally competent, given that rule there, that measurement rubric. When they do them, this evidence will come out, and then I can show you what's there. So they can build a series of tasks that will provide evidence or an image that can be used to locate the students on the rubric. They can be different for different disciplines, they're different units. It doesn't matter, because you're not comparing to each other, you're comparing to the measurement rubric. Right? And the rubric is constant across all subjects at our university, across years, and so on. And the evidence is the work that the students have delivered in response to the task. Reporting can be via the difference in the work samples or a written description of what performance the student has displayed. Now, in terms of some of the work we're doing, we have people measuring compassion. We have people measuring self-feedback. Okay? How good are our students at generating feedback from different situations? What does good look like, etc.? The things that we value. We have schools doing this at the school level that are saying, well, we want our students to be engaged. How do I know whether they're engaged? Let's define engagement. So we've got schools doing this, parents involved, student voice, parent voice. It's got the potential to really change the things that we're doing and how we're doing it, because it allows us to say, this matters to us. We can measure against it. But it isn't easy. You know, if I've worked with systems here that want to measure Catholicity, say the Catholic system, what characterizes your system, because if you say all our students have faith, somebody's going to say, where's your evidence they've got faith, and where's some evidence that you're actually improving it? So then sitting down and doing that definition and saying what characterizes this, looking at outcomes, it's hard work. But once it's there, it's the way we operate. And so we think it's a big step in moving forward as a system and systems, using this strong measurement base to answer to tackle the issue of, let's start measuring what we value rather than just valuing what we can measure. But I'll stop the talk there and open up for questions. But who's asked the question?
The question is the difficulty that we are trying to measure something in the brain, which is not a physical quantity in a traditional sense?
Well, but that's true of measuring science, isn't it? Physics. I mean, we can't see physics. I mean, it's somewhere in there. So I would think, I think that's the challenge for social science people anyway. We can't actually see it. I can't take the top of somebody's head. I'll find the neuron which has got how much science they've got and measure it. So that's what we do in measurement in the social sciences. We actually have to design tasks which enable the students to show us what's in here. So I can't see them like I can in the physical sciences. And I've got to think of it differently. I've got to think about it. When I write my test, when I give the students a task to do in whatever construct, it's there. What they do is they respond to it, and the response tells me how much of this thing they've got. And that's why it's important that we actually have what we call good valid tasks, good assessments, which are really telling us about the construct we want. So yes, I agree, it's a challenge, but I think it's a challenge every one of our teachers faces. I think it's a challenge every one of our systems around the world faces. And I think we do it better in some things than others. What I think we haven't really faced up to is the things that the government say we really need to be able to get some idea of how our going. We haven't really tried to make that transition and say, well, if we value these, I've got to start thinking about how I'm going to get some evidence about it. And so it isn't that the process is that different than what we do. It's really the same. It's actually, how do I define the construct? How do I show growth? Now, how do I create opportunities for the students to demonstrate what it is they know and can do in relation to that definition and that construct? It's a good question, but I think it's pretty standard.
Thank you, Professor, for that. There's another question. Is this measurement one which foregrounds judgment and therefore has to depend on expertise of the assessor?
I think the way we talk about here is because we're running it as we're talking about actually changing systems and working at system level. Ultimately, of course, yes, I agree. It's going to rely on our teachers, our lecturers to have the assessment literacy skills to be able to write the tasks that will generate the right evidence, right? And they write valid and reliable tasks or whatever it is they do. But yes, that's true. We're saying that's going to be done by a whole university and all our people should be reporting against it. PISA does this. They say, here's a construct, these are the components, there it is. Then they have their experts develop assessments and say, well, everybody's got to do this assessment because if we standardize that assessment and put you on that scale and we can measure that and so on. So, there are variants here. You can have experts who write those tests, but not the way we think. We're thinking more or less, if you want to really have an impact in a system level, assessment matters at a system level. We must all be in that space. How can it be done by schools? How can it be done by systems? How can it be done by universities? And that's where we're trying to work. Let's try and look at how this can be done. Collect evidence can be done, etc. But the trick is to make sure that the people in our schools, our teachers, our university lecturers do have good assessment development skills. So that means they're assessment literate to improve that to a level where they can do this well, which is really quite important anyway. We want our teachers to be well trained and to be able to do this and write good assessments. So I think it goes hand in hand that people have to be able to do it. So let's put our energy into defining these and then helping our teachers write better tasks. Because, well, I see assessment very broadly. It's not just a test, it's observations. It's questionnaires, it's checklists, it's listening, it's self-assessment. All those can provide the evidence that we can use to locate students on that scale. The way we assess our teachers' growth through professional standards, that's built up as a rubric, teaching effectiveness. The teachers themselves do the assessments. They provide the evidence to say, I'm at this level, here's my evidence, and somebody checks the evidence and the quality. And a lot of them have to be told to go back and have a look because the way you collected that wasn't that good. So yeah, it's part of a capacity building exercise as well.
Thank you, Professor. There's one more question. This is going to be the last. We are trying to measure learning from the brain via non-direct method. Will other technologies take over versus traditional assessment, which can't always capture learning?
Yeah. We've been working, with Ai Wang in China, who's looked. they want to actually look at the impact on because in Chengdu there's the aviation training university there for trains all their pilots, and they want to look at the impact that stress has on how people react, in speaking, because pilots speak in English and the Chinese is speaking in English, and then a wing falls off and there's stress, they regress and they start instructing in their back language, etc. So we do a lot of ways of measuring things like stress as the indicator. We look for anything that says, right, if I'm interested in the extent to which stress impacts on learning, then I have to work out what's the best way to measure stress, and it could be technological things or philosophical, whatever it is, measures. It can be whatever. What's the best way for me to collect evidence that the student is actually demonstrating that? Yeah, good question. But we don't. It's not only written tests, etc. It's all forms of evidence that we can use and collect to answer that question. Where are we? Where are our students? Are we having an impact? And how can we help our students move? And we can finally answer the question of government much more meaningfully than saying, okay, this is what we want, but by the way, you can do your literacy and numeracy pretty good. That's always going to be important. But how about these others? We need some indicators so we're also improving these things. We think just taking those one at a time, working on them and thinking about them, we can have an impact on what really matters for our education systems.
Thank you, Professor. I think that'll be all. On behalf of the Global Citizenship Foundation, the Council for GCD, and all of our attendees, I would like to thank you, Professor, for making time for all of us here and share your unique ideas, insights, and experiences. Thank you so very much, because I know it's been a busy day for you. Thank you so much.
That's okay. It's a pleasure. And thank you for turning up. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. We'd like to thank formally our valued support partner for the collaboration in helping advance inclusive and transformative education conversations like today's, and to thank you all of you for being part of the Educational Leadership Forum. Thank you so much, everyone. It was a wonderful session. Thank you, Professor.
No worries. Pleasure. Love. Everybody, thanks for coming. Love for coming.